Good evening all and welcome. Before the video begins, I have a quick announcement. I'm running a special offer on Patreon. To anyone who wants to help support the channel financially, of course it really does mean the world to me, and to anyone who signs up to the $10 tier between today and the 1st of April, will receive a special handwritten thank you note from me in the mail, as well as some exclusive stickers to go along with it. As a thank you. I really do appreciate it, and if you want to find out more, you can find a link at the top of the description. But for now, it's time to get comfortable and let the darkness take control. I was out for a walk early one morning in a forest preserve that's usually pretty empty. I started coming around a corner, and I can see a car that's parked on the grass just outside of a parking lot. I think it's strange, but keep on walking. I'm probably about 50 feet from the car now, and suddenly the trunk pops open, the car alarm starts going off, and the driver's side door opens. I'm coming from the passenger side and can't see the driver, but I get a bad feeling about the situation. I keep walking on the path and come around where I can see the driver's side of the car. A guy is sitting in the driver's car seat and starts to wave me over to him. He throws his hands up and says, "I'm not sure what's going on, but can you help me?" I tell him, nah, he's on his own, without breaking my stride, and keep moving. He throws up his hands again, turns off the car alarm, gets out, shuts the trunk, gets in and drives away. I'm creeped out, so once he's out of sight, I double back and walk the opposite way just to be safe. I walk back about half hour to get to the lot where I parked my car. When I'm getting close, I hear the car alarm go off again. It freaked me out now, but I didn't want to walk back to the woods again, so I keep going to the parking lot. When I get there, that same car is parked with its trunk open, car alarm going off and driver's door open. The guy is already talking to someone else in the parking lot. He sees me come into the lot, looks at me for about a minute, shuts off the car alarm, closes the trunk and drives away. I just booked it to my car and called the park rangers, but they didn't believe anything was weird about it, and I'm 90% sure that dude was trying to kidnap someone. This happened last summer. My husband's best friend flew out of LA to visit us in rural Iowa. My husband grew up in LA, but I was raised here, and this is where we decided to settle down. We wanted to give our friend the full rural/small town experience, and one thing you don't realize when you're from the city is how completely pitch black it is out here, with no street lamps or city lights to illuminate the night. It's something my husband commented on when he first moved here. There is a dense forest that covers several square miles just outside of town. It's a protected wildlife reserve. There are a lot of legends about this forest being haunted, because it was the site of a bloody battle between Native American tribes and a burial ground. The creepy old stone tower and dilapidated amphitheater in the middle of the woods are said to be especially haunted. There is also a pond in the heart of the forest that the locals refer to as Dead Man's Lake, because someone drowned in it several years ago and the body was never recovered. I'm not sure if it was accidental or suicide, as I've heard many renditions to the story. I don't believe in ghosts, and I'm not afraid of the dark or the woods, but my husband's friend does. This park technically closes at 10 p.m, but we decided to risk it and took our friend to the forest at midnight on a moonless night. We visited the tower first. I'd never seen it at night, and the sight of the black silhouette against the starry sky, surrounded by gnarled, dead trees, was an unsettling one that set the mood for the rest of the night. After a little convincing, we got our friend to follow us into the tower, up the old, creaky spiral staircase, and we spent some time surveying the surrounding scenery and enjoying our view of the clear night sky from the tower's rooftop. The view was magnificent, and I thought it looked magical, but our friend just seemed to be getting more nervous by the second. We hiked back down the long dirt trail to the car, but kept hearing what sounded like footsteps coming from the trees on both sides and from behind us. Our friend was scared it could be something paranormal, but I was worried about drug dealers or meth heads, since there is a large population of sketchy people and frequent meth lab busts in the area. My husband and I both had our 9mm pistols strapped to our belts, but we didn't want to have to use them. We picked up our pace, back to the car, and drove further into the forest, to the place where the trail to the old amphitheater begins. Our friend was really on edge now, since the trees are much denser in this part of the forest and it was incredibly dark. We convinced him to follow us down the steep, rocky trail to the amphitheater. When we arrived, I noticed a tall structure standing in the center of the amphitheater that had never been there before, but it was too dark to tell what it was. I had been using only the light of my smartwatch to guide the way, so as to not ruin the eerie illusion created by the inky darkness of the forest with a flashlight beam. At this point, even my husband was becoming uneasy and wanted to turn back, but I had to know what the mysterious object was, which had appeared in the last 2 days since my last hike to this part of the forest. I carefully made my way down into the center of the arena and drew closer to the structure, my husband and our friend following closely behind. When I was a few feet from the object, I lifted my wrist to illuminate it with the light from the watch, and I felt a sense of dread and fear wash over me. Standing before me was a 10-foot-tall wooden arch strapped with red silk and adorned with animal bones and red roses. The skull of a deer with massive antlers was mounted at its peak. A smaller object that sat lower to the ground that I hadn't seen before looked to be some kind of stone altar. Suddenly, the rustling noises coming from the forest on all sides that I had previously chalked up to animals or the wind seemed much more threatening. My first thought was that it was a malicious cult or a band of Satanists that were lying in wait to sacrifice us to a demon. As ridiculous as it sounds, in that moment it seemed likely and possible thanks to fear. All three of us jumped and turned towards the direction of our car when we heard a car door close and saw the faint glow of headlights peeking through the trees. We rushed back up the trail expecting to find some crackheads attempting to break into our car. We didn't know whether to be relieved or apprehensive when we saw a DNR truck parked next to our car. The officer was scanning the trees with his flashlight and greeted us and asked us what we were up to. We told him that we were showing our friend around, and he informed us the park was closed. He noticed our firearms and asked for our permits and ID, which we gave him. He went back to his truck to run our info and returned minutes later with an $80 ticket for being in the park past closing time. After that, we spent about 15 minutes having a friendly chat with the officer. When he asked, "So what's the amphitheater like at night?" I told him it was really creepy and proceeded to describe what we witnessed. The officer chuckled at the terrified looks on our faces and told us that a wicker couple had rented the amphitheater for their wedding tomorrow and had been to it today to decorate. So a bit of a disappointment ending, and I was relieved at first but also disappointed, and planned to return to the forest on another night in the dark, but this time I'll go alone, and on foot so the DNR cannot find me. This is the story of how my boyfriend decided he was not an outdoorsy type of person. Let me take you back. My boyfriend, sweet as he may be, went on a small camping trip with one of his close friends, Matt. And after a successful 2 days of camping and hiking, which he loved, he impressed upon me the importance of getting with nature and going out and exploring the wilderness, something which I had never done before. It didn't really interest me all that much. Sure, parks are nice, but spending nights out in the wilderness certainly wasn't something that sounded that appealing to me. But he persisted, and so around Valentine's Day weekend, he arranged everything. He got the gear off his friend, and we were going to spend the weekend out in the sticks. Honestly, our day didn't go according to plan. As we began making our way there, we ended up getting lost, as it was in an area that had very little signal, and if you didn't know where you're going, getting lost was only too easy. It took about an extra hour until we managed to find the right road, and it was already past midday at this point. We stopped in a little town, had food, and then finally made our way towards our destination. Now, I should probably point out that being February, it gets dark quite quickly, and that being the case, it was already starting to get dark. So, my boyfriend, who roughly remembers where he had camped with his friend, insists that we must follow the trail to get to this amazing spot, a lovely place to wake up. We gather all the gear and walk, in the dusk, towards our destination. I tried to be optimistic for his sake. I wasn't having a great time, because walking in near darkness at this point with only a flashlight to guide us wasn't exactly my idea of fun, but tried to be optimistic in the hopes that I would be wrong. As we carried on walking, my boyfriend inevitably got lost, and after about half an hour of looking for the spot he had planned on, we settled on just hunkering down wherever we could find a good space, which didn't take all that long. But now we didn't know where we were, or he for that matter. We adventured far off the trail in the hopes to find the location his friend had promised him in the dark. And although we didn't feel super great, we figured that come light, we should be able to find our way back. So we set up our tent with much difficulty given the darkness and our one flashlight, and eventually had a little bite to eat before falling asleep. I, however, found it hard to get to sleep. My boyfriend seemingly just put himself in his sleeping bag and passed out no problemo. I, on the other hand, had never been outside before when I needed to sleep. I was always in the quiet of my room, and hearing all the outside noises while I was trying to sleep. Every time my boyfriend moved, it made a rustle on the ground from the fallen leaves. It bothered me, and I found it very hard to get comfortable and fall asleep because of it. So I lie there awake, staring at the darkness, hoping that eventually sleep would come for me. I don't know how much time passed. I was in and out of consciousness. It felt like every noise woke me. But suddenly I heard what was unmistakably footsteps in the distance. My ears perked up, and I lie there listening, now more awake than ever. There were people, but I couldn't see any flashlights, as they would be very visible through the canvas of the tent. As I listened, I could hear two men talking. They sounded a bit drunk, to be fair. One of them I heard fall over, and they were definitely approaching our direction. Suddenly, I saw what appeared to be the beam of a flashlight shine over and not directly touch our tent, but it was clear they'd seen us, as one man started shushing his friend. They started going, shh, 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 and talking in hushed tones. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but I was fairly sure that it was something to do with ambushing our tent, or at least looting it. At this point, I just about crapped a brick. I felt true fear, the likes of which I don't think I'd ever felt in my life, surge through me. Here were people with bad intentions, and I was out here in the dark, basically alone because my boyfriend sleeps like a log, with my only protection being a flashlight, while these two men approach us both to do who knows what with who knows what, and I really didn't want to find out. I frantically look around while trying to make as minimal noise as possible. Do I have any form, any way to defend myself? We didn't bring anything. No mace, no weapon, no knife, nothing. We decided to pack light, and it being quite rural, we didn't think anything bad would happen, least of all animals, as there aren't any dangerous animals where we live. Humans never came into the equation, which was our mistake. I grabbed my power bank, which is heavy and probably the only thing that's heavy enough to hurt if it hits someone on the head, and I grabbed it in my hand like the brick it is, and waited as I moved silently towards the flap of the tent in case someone stuck their head in. I've realized that if they shined their flashlight, they'd be able to see exactly where I was in the tent, and that concerned me. But figured if that were to pass, I'd just lie down as quick as I could in the hopes to remain unspotted. And there I waited, as the shuffling feet drew ever closer in the silence of the forest. The men had now reached the tent, shushing each other and walking around it slowly. Thankfully, they didn't shine the flashlight into the tent, probably because they wanted to check to see if anyone was in there and not wake them, in case we were the ones who were going to prove dangerous. As I waited, anxiety and anticipation flooding every neuron of my brain and every cell of my being, filling me with pure primal dread, did I hear the sound of the zipper slowly come undone. I waited, in the darkness, for anyone to push their head through to check if we were there. And right as a solitary head started making its way through the zipper, I smashed him in the head with the power bank. A sound emanated, a crunch, the likes of which I could have never anticipated either. I smacked him directly on the nose with as much force as my adrenaline-fueled hand could muster, and the scream that erupted from this man was more like a roar as he fell backwards and started yelling at his friend to get the hell out of there. I looked down at my power bank, and despite the fact it was a moonless night and I could barely see anything, I could feel the blood on it and could almost taste it in the air. The men screamed and ran, almost like we'd assaulted them, and my boyfriend, obviously woken from the commotion, asked what the hell happened. When he realized what happened, we started dismantling the tent and told ourselves it was time to leave. Once he'd done that, and everything had been packed away, it was still dark, and we used our flashlight to try and find where we were going, but the problem still persisted. We had absolutely no clue. We stood there in the dark, waiting, wondering what the hell our next move should be. So, in the little clearing that we'd found, we moved over to near some trees, put our bags behind them, and tried to be as hidden as possible, and just lied together down in the grass, waiting for the sun to shine so that we could make our exit quickly. As we waited in the darkness, we heard footsteps farther and further away. We were worried that they would return, but they never did. When the first rays of dawn started arriving, we looked around and made our way to try and find where we'd come from. When we got back through our little clearing, we noticed a startling amount of blood just on the floor where our tent was, and a clear trail. I assumed that these people, if they were walking around in the woods in the middle of the night, probably had some inkling where to go, and following a trail of blood. And just to paint the proper picture, it wasn't a huge flowing trail, it was just the occasional droplet by that point. We managed to find our way eventually to the path. It took us twice as long to leave as it did when we arrived, but I was grateful nonetheless to have gone. The end of our camping saga, filled with misfortune. I suppose it just wasn't meant to be. And with that, I conclude the story. My boyfriend and I made it home safely and decided it would probably be best to never go camping again, which to this day we haven't done. Stay safe out there. And to anyone wandering the woods in the middle of the night, hoping to take advantage or rob anyone while camping, let's not meet. Several years back, on a bright winter afternoon, I decided to take my nephew, who was 7 at the time, and my son of 3, and my dog on a short hike at a local park. We were walking through the woods on a trail when my dog started barking. I looked over to see a man standing in the woods about 50 feet away facing us. I couldn't see his face because he had one of those fur-lined hoods on, so with the distance and the shadows from the trees in his hood, from my perspective, there was nothing but a black hole where his face should be. I gave an awkward wave, but he remained motionless, and I had a weird feeling, so I decided to just keep moving and make our own way back to the car. I felt like we were being watched, so we looked back a few minutes later, and the man was just standing in the woods. But I knew he had moved because he was still about 50 feet away, and we had gone quite a way. My dog was growling, and the kids and I were starting to be creeped out. We kept moving, and I suddenly hear the sound of fast, heavy footsteps in the snow. I look back, and this time I caught the guy running in our direction, but he stopped as soon as I saw him and went back to just staring motionlessly from afar, now closer than he was before. My dog was going nuts at this point, and my mind was racing with possibilities. So I discreetly gave my nephew my phone and quietly told him that if anything happened, he needed to take his cousin and run as fast as they could to the car and call for help. I figured if anything, the dog and I could at least hold the guy off for long enough for the kids to get away. I think my dog may have scared him off because he ended up turning around and going in the opposite direction. I never really told anyone because I didn't want to come off as being dramatic, but it certainly frightened the hell out of me, as anyone who's being followed can probably relate to. There's a giant forest right next to my house, and there will be times when the mood takes me that I will go down there to draw, chill, and take pictures. One time I was lying on a hammock that was set up by the people who last lived there. Just as I was chilling, I lost my balance and regrettably fell out of the hammock. Right before I fell, I saw a knife sticking straight up in the air, planted in the dirt so it would stick right up. The knife did not stab me, but it caught on my sweater, and I was thinking just how lucky I was. Right by the knife, there was a wooden cross, a 6 by 6 foot wooden cross, and as you can imagine, after this terrifying incident, I elected to not go back into the forest anymore for fear of my own safety and the absolute creepiness of some people. I go hunting in southern Illinois on a property that my family owns. The place is my second home, and I've spent countless hours exploring all around every inch of it. Caught all the fish in the area, hunted every legal game, and spotted the rest. So when I say that I've never had an experience like this, just remember this was my domain that I felt comfortable in any weather at any time with any equipment or lack thereof. 2 deer seasons ago, I had pulled into the farm at about 4:40 in the morning. November, so at least 2 hours till sunlight. I pull my stuff out of the truck and walk into the woods. I have my shotgun and a revolver/knife on my belt, an elbow light clipped to the front of me, and thermos of coffee, and a backpack with a book and a few other things for cleaning my deer should I get lucky. So I walk off the drive and into the woods. The tree stand I'm going to is less than a mile away, but through some dense second-growth forest and down a rather steep hill, across some bottoms, then a lung-burning steep climb up another ridge. I always dread the hike, but it's a good spot, so I go often. I make it down to the bottom, slush through the icy muck, and get climbing. With my flashlight clipped to my chest, I keep needing to physically turn my body to throw the beam around to see the trees that I recognize to determine my path. This, of course, always gives the forest a horror movie vibe, even on the best of days. The leaves and underbrush are encased in frost, so every one of my steps comes with a solid crunch no matter how quiet I'm trying to be. This time, though, I noticed there was more noise than usual. Something else was crunching close by too. I walked about a quarter of the way up the hill listening to my company the whole time, seeming to stay the same distance away as I moved. Naturally, I think to myself that I'm going to have a quick hunting day, so I plop my ass down next to a tree. Can't shoot till first light, but I'm hoping if I stay really still, whatever I'm hearing will lounge around until then. So I click my light off, unsling the shotgun, and lay on my knees to wait. Except I don't hear anything. Whatever it was must have been spooked by my flashlight, spinning all around as I sat. I still stayed a bit, sipping some coffee to make sure, but gave up after 15 minutes or so of dead silence from the forest. I probably didn't even make 4 steps before the second moving thing starts again. At this point, I'm still not freaked out. I'm facing the way I am and flip the light off again and sidestep behind a tree. Sure enough, I don't hear anything again. 2 minutes of sitting there frustrated before I begin moving again, and my new friend does too. This is when I started to get freaked out, because I worked my way up the hill hoping to turn and look every so often. When I stopped, the sound would go on for just an infinitesimally longer amount of time than my own step, like something seeing me stop and doing its very best to stop before I heard it. This happened no less than 4 times, and by now I'm sweating bullets and freezing cold because I'm sweating bullets in the middle of winter. I abandoned my thermo near a tree so I could hold my flashlight and my revolver at the same time. The last 100 feet to my stand was done backwards so that I could face the noise and in theory keep it from moving, and I didn't hear anything after that. I got up into my stand, smoked about 5 cigarettes in a row, and gave me a sense of security being up a tree behind camouflage. Still, I only hunted for about an hour of daylight and went back early, and I wasn't moving slowly heading back to the truck even with the sun shining bright. I haven't told my family about it because they wouldn't believe me, but damn, it was freaky. The sound, and when it decided to happen, felt very human, which it likely was, as poachers and trespassers occasionally wander onto our property. But still, ever since then when I go hunting, I am much better about letting people know where I am going, and for how long, because you never know what can happen when you're out in the woods. The following are a collection of stories that happened to me at a popular national park, and they are all true. The first story starts with me trekking into the desert on my own. To give you some context, I'm in my mid-20s, and I started to camp and hike alone quite a bit, and when I hiked, I would seek as remote a location as possible. I'm a 5'5" petite female and honestly made some pretty dumb decisions like wearing headphones while wandering in terrain alone, but I had a lot of fun and have since gotten smarter about handling myself in the wilderness. I had hopped into my car and headed to the desert, as I so often do, and picked a spot where to park where there were no cars or tourists or people of any sort, grabbed my pack and my headphones and excitedly hopped out of the car to go off and explore and climb some rocks in the distance. I'm feeling good until I get not even a mile out and I see this huge bullet in the dirt. My dad, who is law enforcement and was a National Guard later, said the way I described it by size that it had to be from a grounded gun, and there was no way someone would just be walking through the desert with this weapon. Something about it unsettled me, and I didn't know if I should bring it to the ranger or what. I felt weird taking it with me, so I ended up just awkwardly burying it and moving on. For whatever reason, it put me intensely on edge. I felt jumpy and jarred, and was having none of the usual relaxation I have on my treks. A few steps later, I heard the weirdest noise I've heard in my life. It was a high-pitched buzzing/electrical noise that just encompassed the space around me. Now, if you know the desert, you know the acoustics can sometimes get a bit weird since noise bounces off rocks, but this was akin to nothing I've heard, and my instinctual reaction was sheer panic. I fumble for my phone and surprisingly have reception, so I call my then boyfriend and he tells me it's probably nothing and that I should enjoy myself. I take a few more steps and the noise instantly starts again, louder, and my body is screaming to hightail it back to my car, which I do. I'm stumbling over myself. I'm back on the phone with my boyfriend, feeling like I'm being chased. I make it back and feel a rush of relief as I get to my car. I know this may sound anticlimactic, but the amount of fear I felt in that moment is something I've never felt before or since. It felt like a warning of sorts to stay the hell away. I strongly believe in intuition, so I trusted my gut that it was nothing good. I'm hoping someone has experienced something similar to this and has insight, because I'm yet to find out any useful information. My second story takes place at the same national park. One thing I love about it is there's a fairly decent chance you'll see weird stuff in the sky at night. I attribute it to the fact that there is a military test pilot base fairly close, but what you see is some really strange phenomena. This was the most interesting one I've seen. The openness of the desert makes it easy to see the beautiful night sky above you. One particular night, I looked up and see some objects flying high and off in the distance. If I remember correctly, one was white and one was red. They moved in a strange formation and at a pace too fast for any aerial physics I know of. I can't imagine the G-force involved or how we could have the technology that allows for speed that fast. I'm in awe watching this for a while. Them zipping around, and to make things even more baffling, they moved in diagonal lines at certain points, like literally making acute angle turns on a hairpin. They would also sometimes pause and suspend, then zip around more. The final spectacular was when I start to see them fly towards each other and seemingly merge into one object. It then changed color. Now this singular object shines a little brighter and slowly fades out to nothing. It was one of the most bizarre and amazing things I've ever seen. I'm guessing it's military related, so either they have some crazy aerial technology, or they're in cahoots with the extraterrestrials. This is a quick story from when I was growing up in northern Kentucky in the 90s. I would have been around 10. I'm in my 30s now, but I vividly remember this happening and still think about it frequently. My best friend lived with his grandparents for a bit on several acres of land in Walton, Kentucky, and I spent almost every weekend there. They never really did much with the land. It remained relatively cleared, but there were no farms or structures on it. They had a horse stable near the house, but that was it. My friend had received a go-kart for his birthday, so we were out driving it around on the open land. It was just the two of us, and we were having a blast riding this thing around. It was getting close to dusk, and we knew we were both going to have to pack it up pretty soon. We came to a stop, and the engine cut out, and almost at the same time, both of us had this strange sensation come over us. We felt like we were both being watched by something. It's weird how our lizard brains can still even process something like this, but we both agreed there was a weird, overbearing feeling. We hadn't heard his grandpa's truck, and we were too far away to be seen from the house, so we began looking around. We were in an open field in the middle of their land, and it was surrounded by trees and tall brush, but something caught my eye first, and I got my friend to look in the same direction. In that brush, we could see a long, almost black-shaped thing sitting very still. I know at this point in the story, most of you are thinking Bigfoot, and I can say I remember things being dead silent. Even now I sometimes wonder if it was something else we saw, but all I remember is thinking it was a giant black wolf, about 200 feet away from us, and it was sitting perfectly still. But to me it looked furry. I couldn't make out any other personal features like eyes or ears, but I swear this thing was making us feel watched. It's like when you see a cat getting ready to pounce. That was what it felt like we were looking at. We were both getting really spooked by this point. The sun was getting low behind the tree line, and one of us was going to have to jump out and pull start the engine back up. We were whispering about what it was that we were watching. Honestly, I forgot which one of us jumped out and started the car back up. But when we looked back at the black shape, it was gone. The go-kart didn't have lights, so we drove as fast as we could back to his grandparents' house, and we told them what we saw. His grandparents said we probably saw a coyote or maybe a boar, but the shape was long and low, and a coyote doesn't sit well in my head with what I saw, not to mention pitch black and furry. Every few years I think about this story, and I've read there are no more wolves in Kentucky. I think I've convinced myself it was a coyote. Me and my dad went hunting a year or so ago, and we found this enormous pile of bones. The scary thing was we found a human skull, but the rest of the bones were from farm animals and other forest creatures. It was at this point we decided it'd be best to get the authorities involved, but we also walked further to see if there was more we could uncover. I wish we'd have just gotten the hell out of there, because we found several large holes that were recently dug and filled back in again. Me and my dad never went hunting there again because neither of us could stomach it, and never followed up to find out what it was the authorities uncovered. I shiver to think about it and don't want to know. I am a wilderness survival instructor and security contractor. A few days ago, a student of mine and good friend who I had taken out into the woods before told me his dad just got 150 acres of land in a secluded mountainous part of my state. It had a large amount of forest on it that hadn't been explored yet, as his dad was only building something for his horses that took up about 100 yards of the property, and his horses were free to roam at the moment. He said his dad got an insane deal on the property. My friend is now a dad of 3, and I knew he didn't get out into the woods that often. So I agreed to go with him because it seemed really fun, and I can imagine he needs a getaway every now and then. We were both indigenous, into cars, into wilderness survival, and all sorts of stuff, so we never run out of anything to talk about in the woods. His dad, however, did express to us that he didn't want anyone exploring the woods unless they had a gun. He said it was because he saw coyotes. Now, we're all indigenous here, we're all raised in the same state. Coyotes don't actually attack people. My friend, called RC, also told me a while back, when we were first at the property, that he saw movement in the tree lines that was roughly human-sized and shaped, but couldn't really tell since his eyesight wasn't superb. I bought my AR and a small flint napping kit just for the fun of it, and we set off onto the property. We explored a lot of the rolling fields, creeks, and multiple natural springs and ponds. Everything felt normal. It was a beautiful landscape. Eventually, we decided to get to the forested part of the property, as it hadn't been explored yet. As soon as we entered the tree line, the entire mood shifted. The forest had an ambience of its own, very similar to the woods in the movie The Ritual. The woods were grey and dead silent, save for the occasional creaking of tall, tired cedar trees. There was a very small stream running through the center of it with sand that was black. It felt like we were surrounded, watching from all sides. It didn't take long before a very putrid stench hit our nostrils. It was the odor of rotting flesh. We decided to follow the smell and found the remains of 3 to 4 cows. We examined the exposed skulls and couldn't find any bullet holes. It didn't appear to me that these cows had been put down. Something killed them though, and their bones were spread over 30 yards. There were large indentations in the dirt all around them, since they were very vague in their shape. We decided to press on into the woods. Now, we were accompanied only by silence, the putrid odor of death, and the sound of our own heartbeats. We kept stopping at the stream, as I noticed several different types of tracks, large coyote tracks, and something else that was large but intentionally avoided the sand, it seemed. We pressed on into the woods until we started to find trees that had been bent over and pinned behind other trees while they were still alive. Something that could never, ever happen naturally. We hiked on and found what I can only describe as a tool made of bone lying on the ground. It was extremely crude, but looked like some kind of scooping tool or knife. It was disturbing because although it looked primitive, it looked way more primitive than a person could make, but an intentionally shaped tool nonetheless. We hiked on until we found a clearing with a pond that had a more large oval track surrounding it. On the other side of the pond, we found a very strange little tree structure. It was an A-frame. It had rocks placed up against it. However, it wasn't that sturdy, and the rocks were very peculiarly placed. We found no signs of any campfires around it. We found no trash camping. This isn't exactly a place you could hike to from a house. I photographed and made a video of the little hut thing. It was getting dark, so we decided we should head back. I had a flashlight on my AR, but didn't want to rely on that in the dark with something that kills cows and could make tools out of their bones somewhere behind us. We made our way out of the forest and back to where the trucks were parked just in time before it got too dark to see. As we were leaving, we saw something on top of one of the hills that we couldn't identify, but didn't stick around to find out what it was. It's worth mentioning that the previous owner began construction on something of the property, abruptly halted construction and left. My friend and I were hiking on some abandoned and unused land. It was really beautiful with lakes, cliffs, and tons of trees. The hike was going really well, but close to dark it turned around. My friend whispered to me that they had been thinking of skinwalkers and couldn't stop. This got me thinking the same, and we decided to head back to the car to eliminate any risk. A few minutes into the hike back, we both got a horrible feeling and it became apparent we weren't alone. We kept making our way back to the car as fast as we could, but it kept getting worse. Both of us experienced blurred vision, and the air suddenly got thick and had a hum to it. It also became incredibly hard to move, and we both experienced an intense urge to lay down and stop hiking. We came across an area we hadn't yet hiked through, but was adjacent to where we were, and there were so many deer prints in every direction, as if a deer had been rapidly pacing there and human footprints on the other side of the scramble. There weren't any clear starting points of the footprints, and no evidence of other hikers for miles. The trek back to the car seemed to take 5 minutes and 3 hours simultaneously, so no clue how long it took. Neither of us had felt this sense of dread or been this disoriented before. Do you think we had a close encounter with something supernatural, or was it something else entirely? Any information or ideas would be appreciated. For my story, I want to take you to a place I called home, in Kentucky County, comprised of old coal mining towns that at one time had a bustling economy. Arling. Unfortunately, coal mining died a slow and painful death, and so has my home, which saddens me greatly. Arling is one of the most beautiful places I've ever seen, nestled into the heart of one of the oldest mountain ranges on Earth. The Appalachian Mountains have a tangible natural spirit to them. I, along with my girlfriend and roommate, often hike old trails around the county in hopes of finding interesting sights to see. We are always looking for somewhere neat to hike far out in the sticks. I had a friend of mine ask some of his work buddies if they knew of any rural pathways to test out. One of them mentioned that his father had hiked a path ascending a mountain beside what we call the Old Lake, and that the place scared him to death. The Old Lake is part of a forsaken wildlife management area about 10 miles outside of town towards the state lines, at the base of Mount Mason. The government property only goes so far. Far beyond that is private land owned by a local wealthy family, and presumably abandoned too. The man's father told us how he once hiked along the ascending trail that follows the creek from the lake and up into the mountains past the wildlife management area's boundaries, and I refer to this place as Lonesome Creek. The man crested a hill and prepared to briefly rest upon a flat spot. He quickly took notice of a shady campsite that had evidently been set up on the flat for some time. It was unremarkable at first glance, nothing there but a fire pit surrounded by wooden chairs, but he could just barely see something else beyond the tree line. It looked as though someone had haphazardly poked big sticks into the surrounding forest. A closer look revealed that what he was looking at were pikes, staked into the dirt and adorned with severed cat heads. The man raised up as if he felt something out there and put it as eyes on him. He quickly put distance between himself and Lonesome Creek and has never again so much as visited the old lake. After hearing this story, it dawned on me that I had been told something similar years ago. This story, in two, implied possible ritualistic activity on Mount Mason, As it goes, a mutual friend and his cousin had taken their ATVs on Lonesome Creek at night. Sometime into their ride, the pair spotted a makeshift sitting area right in the middle of the trail. It was shabbily constructed with a few chairs, as well as something like what a preacher holds his Bible on, a pulpit. Even more frightening was a recently doused fire in front of the pulpit. Someone had been there just before they arrived. The two riders killed their engines and unseated themselves, looking around the ridge with their flashlights. As the silence soaked in, they could make out faint voices just beyond some trees on a steep incline near a ridge. Needless to say, they didn't bother shining their lights and left in a hurry. They probed no further, remembering this incident was enough to have made me look deeper into this harrowing mystery. The occult aspect of Appalachia has always intrigued me. Everything from folk magic to the blackest of practices pervades the history of hill folk and their predominantly Scotch-Irish ancestors who emigrated long ago. In the spirit of curiosity, my girlfriend and I took a midday ride up to the back of the old lake, opposite from where the frequented dockside and the family's boat and fish. The road was in rough shape, and upon arrival it was obvious from the massive amount of trash that the Department of Fish and Wildlife had long abandoned this area too. We walked up the seemingly well-travelled path against the downward stream of the creek. After reaching the marked end of the wildlife management area, we decided it was wise to go no further. The sheer seclusion of the place pulled me in, but I needed to take time to plan carefully and gather up a few things and willing folk before we walk along the old Lonesome Creek. After a quick check of Google Maps, it confirmed the garbage-ridden lakeside to indeed be the bottom of the trail. The path appeared to follow the creek up a massive rocky ridge that wrapped around the side of Mount Mason, leading up to an overview of a newer, larger lake a few miles over. Finding out where to go was simple enough, and I suspected that getting there would not be as such. The following Saturday, I managed to gather and prepare 4 of my friends, with which to set out to the old lake. 2 of us came with firearms, the other 2 brought knives and mace. Confident yet anxious, we left the dirty lakeside and followed up parallel to the creek. The lower part of the trail was lined with large jutting rocks that formed caves below and continued up the mountainside. These enormous jagged pieces seemed to have fallen long ago from the massive ridge above which stood Mount Mason like a crown. Past the caves and closer to the lowest part of the ridge was the trail aligned to the rocky old creek bed, now diverted and empty. We stopped to rest at the bottom of the switchback, now at a high enough elevation to be cradled by a lower portion of the ridge overhanging its trail connecting elbow. After some respite under the stone shade, we began to ascend to the top. The path soon wound away from the creek and continued to repeatedly switch back and forth up the side of a steep, stunningly green hill. Studded into the landscape were small scattered stones laid upon by long fallen trees, all covered in moss of a believably ancient color. From this point on, the trail was faint but identifiable. Despite the trash at the trailhead, this high-up forest looked absolutely untouched. After mounting the trail, we wound through thick growth made of a tree I'd never seen before. Once atop the hill, we finally checked on Google Maps to see how far we had gone. To our dismay, we were pinpointed way off the trail on the map. We started considering that there was only one visible trail along the whole path, and what was more startling was that we ended up on a trail not listed on Google Maps at all. Admittedly, this wasn't too worrisome since the path was fairly defined, despite not seeing much action. We assessed that we should make the best of the situation anyway, and pressed on a little further to make good use of the remaining daylight. Google Maps showed that we were near a rock-crawling / ATV tourist attraction on the state line called a Hole in the Rock, a wagon tunnel that cut through the mountain's crown near the top. However, the last and only check-in for the area was 5 years ago. Apparently, we had found ourselves on an old wagon trail stretching from our side through the tunnel and into the next on the other side. The place was old for sure. Exciting was the notion of trekking through an archaic commerce road, passing over the old native land of Mount Mason. Interesting stuff. We resolved to find the wagon tunnel and descend before dark, but we did not make it there in time before having to turn around. Nothing exciting happened, but the place has a very different energy to what I'm used to. I'm deadly serious when I tell you that this place has a very different energy than your typical nature trail. It evoked an unsettling combination of serenity and oppression. I found it the perfect place for strangeness in the primordial wilderness. Lonesome Creek seemed as isolated from the rest as Arling is Appalachia to the rest of America. Yesterday, I rang up a lady whom I have known for quite a long time. Marla has been investigating the weird and wild for nearly 20 years and has written numerous books about local Kentucky myths, folklore, and paranormal stories. She has her own sources, and even helped her find and identify an early 20th century cold case victim. Conveniently enough, it also happened that she and her family live about a mile from the old lake, and I knew that if anyone could point me to something, it would be her. To be quite honest, I did not expect the volume nor magnitude of some of the things she told me on the phone call. I have no bias towards the truth of the two stories I've already recounted, but this is different to me. I believe this woman with everything in me, and do not consider myself naive. When Marla married and moved to the Old Lake Road, it seemed nice enough, rural and quiet. She had her first child in '93, who would grow up to be one of my best friends. When he was barely a toddler, his maternal and paternal grandfather took him out into the woods across the road from their house, through their family cemetery, and up a long dirt path. One day, Marla received a call from her father, asking her to tell her father-in-law, who lived on the same property as Marla and her husband, not to take their son up to the mountains that day. He said he'd seen some strange folk camping up there who seemed a little suspicious. Her father must have been pretty concerned, because later that evening the state police showed up at the cemetery. The authorities informed Marla that they had run some people off the mountain, and they appeared to be trying to set up a site to regularly meet and loiter for whatever purpose. Before leaving the cemetery, the policeman she was speaking to told her plainly, "Between me and you, they were doing some strange things up there." When pressed, he would not say, just shook his head and declined to answer. About a year later, Marla got the gall to go with her husband to where the police ran off the loitering creeps. She claims to have found small animal bones scattered around clearly a once-established site, and a concrete slab fitted into the dirt and etched with what she described as obviously evil symbology. This was a time before cell phones, so she had no photo evidence. The next weird experience to befall Marla did not come for nearly 6 more years. It seemed to have spooked her more than anything else she has told me. One evening, Marla thought it would be fun to take her son, then aged 7, on a walk to the old lake to check out the creek, catch salamanders and find rocks, as they often did along the river which runs behind the property. They made their way towards the lake and followed Lonesome Creek towards the initial incline and past the marked wildlife management area. Apart from the creek babble, Marla caught ear of what sounded like loud voices further into the woods. As her son and her continued up to face the second incline, it became evident that a group of people were gathered towards Mason's Crown. A loud voice echoed from above, booming and fervent like that of a typical southern preacher. The voice spoke rapidly and was periodically answered by a group of voices which spoke in unison. Marla and her son listened intently. The chanting began to cease and everything fell quiet. The eerie silence was broken by the booming man's voice angrily shouting in Marla's direction from high atop the ridge, and Marla grabbed her son and ran all the way back down to the trailhead, fearing that whomever had gathered there had seen her and was warding her off. Like the others, she has never been back to Lonesome Creek. Years after her experience with the chanting voices, Marla recounted a time her father and father-in-law had been part of something unexplainable when traveling the trail from the Kentucky side of Mount Mason. Though they had followed a path that both had been walked many times before, the two men became disoriented and got lost. Marla's father said that an anxious feeling washed over him, and suddenly it was as if they simply were somewhere else entirely. They made it home unharmed, in an amount of time they described as unusually short, but were never able to explain the event. It was later realized that they had somehow ended up on the other side of the state line of Mount Mason, way out there. This was not her only account of this phenomenon. Just 2 years after this incident, her father described 2 fish and wildlife officials showed up at her house in the middle of basically nowhere. The men admitted they had no clue where they were and told Marla that they were trying to get to their destination on the neighboring state side, but somehow became lost and ended up on the Kentucky side. I find it unsettling that despite having maps and being otherwise familiar with the territory, they ended up miles and miles off track. Marla noted they were visibly shaken by the experience. As time has crept, almost 20 years have passed. Marla has searched for answers to her experiences, but has found few. The only presumption she has gleaned is that there have been inexplicable forces in these mountains since they were settled, and probably long before. Appalachia is closely tied with various oddities and old traditions, both good and bad. Benign covens of witches yet existed with unbroken bloodlines, wannabe satanic groups comprised of lunatics who gain pleasure through the infliction of suffering, old secret societies once prominent but have since died, with coal country's prosperous towns dotted across all of rural Appalachia. There is so much to be uncovered, and there is even more that should be altogether left alone.